Hi, this is Chris Hoy. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris. Today I'm going to share a brand new design I just created. It is filled with amazing techniques to create that moody, eerie Halloween atmosphere. So grab your brushes and let's get started. Because I'm using MDF pieces, I always give it a quick prep by using multi-surface sealer. I'm applying it with a 3/4 inch oval wash, brushing the medium on away from the edges, and that's going to help ensure that it's not going to drip down the side edges. This is a super soft bristle brush. The medium's going on very smoothly, very evenly. Only takes a minute, and it's going to really ensure that the pieces will paint very nicely. I'm using the brush to add the medium to all the wider sections, but for those little window paints, it's kind of hard to get in there without having an issue with the paint or medium running down the edge. So I'm using a very dense cosmetic sponge. It's flat on the bottom, just doing a very light touch. Make sure the medium's not on the sponge too heavy, and it will never run down the sides. Giving it a quick dry with my heat it tool. It's super efficient, super quiet, and works very quickly. Now I'm going to sand it lightly with probably about a 220 grit sandpaper. Just need to get nice and smooth, and your brushes will absolutely love you for doing this. Loaded my 3/4 inch oval wash with Sunset Gold, and I'm doing a slip slap. I'm using the flat of my brush, not the chisel edge, and just kind of making an X shape. I'm taking the paint and just letting it slip slap over the entire surface. I want to see the brush strokes, but it's not splotchy. Give it a quick dry again. I've loaded my brush with Black Plum, and needs to be very thin and movable. I added a little more water so I can manipulate it a little bit more. Remember, the candle is going to be in the bottom lower left corner, so I'm starting at the top, kind of working around towards the bottom, keeping that left side a little bit lighter, a little bit brighter. You can see how thin my paint is. It's very, very translucent, almost to the transparent. It's just a hint of color. I picked up more water for this middle area where it's to be lighter, and I'm just letting the color softly go from dark to light. Position the frame so that I can mark. I'm using my chalk pencil. This is a great tool because it disappears with water, but that gives me a good idea where each window pane is, and I can go in. I'm just adding another layer of that Black Plum. Slip slapping. I like that movement in the background, and this is such a great technique for any background. The bigger the brush, the less choppy brush strokes that you'll have to work with. I like using that 3/4 inch. I like the rounded shape. It seems to smooth the paint out and not leave that straight stop and start edge. If you have trouble with paint drying quickly, either use a distress sprayer or a glaze medium to help keep that paint movable. I did go back and add another layer, so in all I have 3 layers, but there's such a very light hint of paint, it's very controllable. If I go on too heavy, then I have to worry about it being too dark, and that's always a struggle to try to figure out how to lighten it up. I've loaded my brush with Payne's Gray. This is such a powerful color that I'm just using a hint of it. And look how mystical that makes that background. Just absolutely love it. I'm just going back to make sure I know where each of these sections is for the window pane. I have a tracing, and remember, this is the first time that I'm painting this. I'm designing it as I go. I'm using my number 2 Radical Round and stroking on the basic shape of the cat. And I'm just going to almost use kind of short, choppy strokes. I want the cat to look a little bit unruly, like he's had the fright of his life. And I can just stroke that on. See how I'm going with just little short strokes. The background will still show through just a little bit. I'm going to be putting lots of layers on so that the strokes that do show are just going to continue to show. With each layer, they're just going to be a little more prevalent. So I'm stroking that on, just getting the basic shape of the cat, and that way I won't have to worry about retracing my lines because I have the basic shape I can just add to. Stroking in the tail, and I want the tail to be kind of poofy, and this cat's kind of worried about everything. Number 5, Radical Round. This is one of my specially designed brushes. It's an excellent brush. I kind of use it for just about everything. I've loaded it with antique white. I'm basing in the candle and the candle flame. And this is just mostly for position. Just antique white is a nice color to begin with. Now I've loaded the toe of my 1/2 inch awesome angle with Payne's Gray, and I'm just floating in where I want that tattered curtain valance to be. The toe is where the heaviest paint is, almost going up and down to get a ragged edge on it and letting that cleaner part of the brush fade out towards the top. And I do jump around. I've loaded my 1/8 inch awesome angle with black plum, and I'm just adding some shadows below and to the right on the candle. Layers, lots of layers, and that's kind of the secret to creating a mystical kind of enchanting effect. It doesn't have to be painted solid and heavy. It's so much easier to do this way. Using my number 12 diverse dry brush, I've loaded it with antique white, and I'm creating that look of Candleglow in the background. Load the brush, wipe it on a paper towel to get rid of the excess, and gently dry brush. These brushes are amazing. If you don't have the diverse dry brushes, they can be used for so many different elements, and it's a great way to add highlights and shading super easy. Once I figure out how much paint is on my brush, I can become a little more aggressive with the dry brushing. It just takes a little time and patience. I put some white on my brush, and I'm just using that to brighten up more so the center area, and you can see how it begins to glow. Just keep brushing and working that until I get a nice brightness. I can always go back and add more until I begin to paint the candle flame, and then it's a little more difficult. I just traced on an oval shape for the spider using my number 5 Radical Round to paint it Payne's Gray. Again, it's not a real heavy color, just an even coverage. And I can go back and add shading and highlighting, which will enhance it. Add a little bit of darkness down at the bottom in the corners of those window panes, just to give a little depth down there with Payne's Gray, pulling some of that up into the candle and up that right side. When I'm designing, I do kind of jump around between different elements in the design. It gives me a better idea of how to balance out the coloring, the shading, the highlighting. It all works together if it's painted together. Just adding a little more Payne's Gray to the shadow side of the candle and the wax. Going back in with antique white to brighten that up. I work between dark and light and build them up equally. Adding a touch of highlight on those little rounded wax tips and the top of the candle, just touching it in. Adding a little more color on the spider. This is with Payne's Gray. Just adding a little more strength so his body doesn't look translucent. Decided that the bottom was going to have a little bit of light bouncing off due to the candle, so I'm going in with antique white to brighten that up. Always when something is lighter color and wet, it's going to appear brighter on the candle. Now I'm jumping down to Snow White to really bump up those highlights. Again, once it dries, it's not going to be as bright as it looks at this point, but this is really a good way to see where those highlights are added and make sure that they have the right impact. Just kind of using the chisel edge of my angle. I did paint the collar and tag for the cat with antique white, and now I'm going in with antique white just to add a few highlights on the cat side facing the Candleglow. Everything's going to bounce the light off of the candle. Again, I'm using just a short choppy strokes. This is fur. He's not well groomed. He's a little bit on the frightened side. He's kind of puffed up and a little bit raggedy looking. I did paint the little bib on the front of him where his chest is. Very, very little detail on the cat. Just a few hints of where his legs are going to be, where his chest is, his ears, just using short strokes of thinned antique white. And this is just going to start showing where all his facial features are, his ears, and the shape of his head, his body, and a little bit on his tail. Don't let this get too strong. This is just the first hint of highlight. And just that little bit, look what a difference that makes. Just going back and forth, this is what I call my fiddle time. Going back, adding highlights, adding shading. If it becomes too bright, then I can tone it down. If it's too dark, I can brighten it back up. I'm adding stronger highlights. This is a very dark design. The colors are very muted and dark and deep, so the highlights need to be very strong and prominent. Using some white to highlight the collar, the tag, and that helps those to stand out. Again, it's going to be the side that kind of reflects off of the candle. Going in with Snow White now to add those cute little whiskers and fluffs of fur here and there, just to make him look kind of adorable and frightened. The paint is very, very thin. I'm using my Epic Script liner. It's an amazing brush. I did design it a little bit longer than a liner, but shorter than a script for more control. So it creates a longer stroke than a liner because of the extra length, but it's very easy to control because it's not quite as squirrely as a script liner would be. Adding those little cheek whiskers. I'm trying to keep the right side a little more muted than the left side, so my highlights at this point are with the white mostly leaning on the left side. I do jump around, hope it doesn't drive you crazy, but while I'm waiting for one area to dry, I just go back to another. I work on all the elements, the cat, the candle, and the spider, and the curtain, off and on until it's all finished. I'm painting the legs with Payne's Gray, and I did make a mistake on the legs. I painted them a little bit too long. They go down below the window pane, so I have to go back later on and move them up. But that's a good reason to pay attention if you use that window pane to make a tracing where the panes are, then that way this won't happen. There, I'm going back. I'm using my Mono Zero eraser. I just dampen it with water and I can remove what I painted and move it up. Loaded the toe of my 1/2 inch angle with antique white, and the toe has the paint on it, and I'm just scooting it up and down along the bottom edge of that curtain, and it just creates, almost magically, it creates that raggedy edge and adds a little bit of folds in there. Back to the candle flame. This is Snow White. I really need that candle flame to be bright and to stand out. The wick is Payne's Gray. And I just use my Epic script liner and pull a really strong wick in there. Going back again with Snow White to brighten that up. You can see how many times I do go back and add the highlights. Once I add it and they dry, they just become a little more diminished. So I really need to go back and strengthen them up. I love the way the wax is coming out. It looks nice and layered. Taking a touch of that golden or sunset gold to make the candle flame yellow, because I put the white behind it, it really glows. I added a touch of that yellow on the wax, and also now I'm adding it on the collar and on the tag. Trying to pull these colors in evenly when I add them, the candle flame, the tag. It just helps to create more of a continuity. I did mix a little bit of that sunset gold and the antique white just to add a few little, golden candle glow hairs on the cat. And put a little bit on that right ear. I was thinking it would be a little bit visible. Don't add too many yellow hairs because then he starts to look not like a black cat. I did pop his little nose in there while I had a little bit of paint on my brush. Now I'm going back with antique white to add his little mouth. Adding a little more bright white to really beef up the highlights on that collar so it stands out. And also on the tag. It doesn't take much to make a big difference. I'm picking up a little bit of Aqua Sky. This is a color that I'm going to be using throughout that's going to add a lot of magical impact. Using it to deepen or define the shaded areas. It's a quiet color, but it has such a magical impact. And it's very subtle, but what it does carries a lot of weight. The area where the eyes are going to be placed, I wanted those to be a little bit darker, so I'm just going back in with Payne's Gray to deepen that up, a little bit of Black Plum, and I'm using kind of choppy little strokes. They're not going to be super visible, but it will look more like hairs than just solid brush strokes of shading. Making sure that neck area behind the collar is darker, and picking up a little bit of antique white on my Epic script liner, making just little slant lines and then pulling it down to create an almond shape, and going right in the center with Payne's Gray, sorry about my hair, to add the eyes. Little bit of Snow White. When I add the Snow White highlights, I do those a little bit at a time, so I'm kind of jumping around at different times. While I have white on my brush, I might add a few more. This way it provides more continuity. The highlights are all equally added, and I do use my finger as a little mop or a smudge. I don't rub it, I just touch it, adding a little highlight in the eyes. Using the same Snow White and my Epic script liner to add the whiskers. This is an amazing brush, a little bit shorter than a liner, longer than a script. Gives excellent control and coverage. Adding that hint of Aqua Sky in the shaded areas, on the curtains, on the cat. Look what a difference that makes. It just cools it down, adds a little bit of mystery. It's just an amazing color. I loaded my number 4 diverse dry brush with Snow White. This brush is so amazing. Look how it creates those candle rays. And I can have super good control. Just a very diverse brush. I can use it for strong highlights or subtle highlights. It's just very impressive. Loaded the toe of my brush with Snow White. I want to enhance the bottom edge of that tattered curtain, especially above the candlelight. A little bit of Candleglow on the bottom of the spider. See how that's starting to pull the reflections from the flame on the spider, on the curtain, and it's just a little bit of paint makes a big difference. Picking up just a hint of that sunset gold, and I wanted to create more of a contrast between the candle flame and the rays that are glowing behind it. So I just added enough and blended it out, making sure I don't cover up those rays. And you can see what a difference that makes to help make that stand out. Dip dotting the spider eyes Snow White and just using the handle end of my brush because it creates a dome. I just go back in with the handle and lift out that excess paint, and it reduces that dome, helps it to dry faster, and it makes a smoother area to paint on. And you see I just keep lifting, and once it starts to dry a little bit, you can't lift anymore. Loaded my Epic script liner with Snow White to create the mouth. To do the teeth, I just pull straight down, and then I paint a V on each side to make those little fangs. Just little touches, it doesn't take much, and fill it in. And that way they pretty much are even. Adding little, I smooth my eye out a little bit, adding a little bit of an eyebrow, and one on the other side. I did paint this in real time, but I took out a lot of the fiddle time. Adding a little bit of red spice on one side of the eye, and a little bit of Payne's Gray on the other, just helps tone those eyes down, gives a little more personality to the spider. Not sure if he's evil or not. And dip dotting the pupils with Payne's Gray. I dip every time I dot, that way they are the same size. Adding a little bit of Snow White highlights on the legs, and I try to keep that consistent. It's pretty much on the top or the left sides, and that helps them to stand out. Remember where that glow's coming from, and a little bit of a highlight in each one of the eyes with a dip dot of Snow White. I did paint this in real time, but I took out a lot of the fussy time. That way you don't have to see me change my mind. And there's a few places on here I did leave some of the original designs that I took out. And here you can see I'm adding more of the highlight hairs on the tail. You can see what a difference it makes, adding some more highlight on the tattered curtain. This gives a look of layers, and it's almost impossible to do it in one fell swoop. This way it creates that gauzy, torn effect without a whole lot of fussiness. Using my liner, I can create little holes in the curtain, and then I can also use that to, I thought it would be fun to add little fringe on the bottom, like tattered threads, just these little details. It just takes a second to create the curtain, but if time is spent adding these little details, that's what makes the most impact. And it's just little touches of paint to pull that down. It looks like it took hours to create this curtain. These are the little tricks. Spend time where it does make a difference, and that will make your painting life a little more fun, and you won't have to get frustrated because it's not all coming together as anticipated. And so often it's all these little touches, until you put those on, it just looks mediocre. And I thought after I added these little bits of threads and tatters at the bottom, I wasn't real pleased with the curtain, but after I did this, I thought, yeah, this is what I wanted. It just looks very old, very worn, very weary. If you have any questions or comments, please list them below. I'll be happy to look at these and answer any that you may have. Just going to brighten up that aqua sky at the top and pull it down a little bit more. Then I go back over it with Payne's Gray. And it's not that I didn't want it there, it's just it needed toned down a little bit. I do put the window pane over top to make sure that all my edges are covered up. Adding just a wee bit of aqua sky in the bottom of that pupil. Little touches are what make a big difference. A little bit on the shaded side of the spider. Pulling that aqua sky into every element is very important. The pumpkin is base coated with sunset gold using my number 10 Fantastic Filbert. If you've not tried my brushes before, they're super high quality. The bristles are a little bit longer, and I know you're going to appreciate having longer bristles because that allows for a longer stroke without having to reload as often. And when you're doing longer strokes, there's less brush marks and you can move the paint around longer and you get a smoother result. That's what makes your painting look a lot better. Canyon Orange, I did let it dry. See how I can pull that all the way down without reloading. One nice long stroke. I usually do the outer sides first, smooth it out, and then I go in to the middle section. And just make sure that that is nice long strokes. If you have a long stroke and there's no stop and start marks, it works out really well. I'm painting the window frame cover antique white, and I'm doing it the same way that I did the multi-purpose sealer, doing the wider parts with a brush, and then I can go back with the cosmetic sponge and just lightly touch on those center panes, and I can add the paint without getting them down the side edges. And I like to keep those side edges dark. It just seems like it gives a nice finish look. If you want to paint the side edges, you can bring the top colors down. But I'm going to be adding a lot of texture on this, and one color by itself probably wouldn't look as good as the dark edges. And you can see it just doesn't take much with that sponge. Just cover it very, very light touch. If you press really hard, the paint's just going to go down the sides. If there's too much paint on the sponge, it's going to go down the sides. This is the base, and I'm going to treat it the same way that I did the window pane. Base coat it with antique white. And I'm using the oval wash. Always paint it toward the outer edge. Never start at the outer edge and pull it toward the center. That's just going to encourage that paint to run down the side edges. Anything you can do to make it easier and a lot less to touch up later on makes the project go a little bit quicker, and it's a little more enjoyable. Loaded the flat of my palette knife with Portobello. I just don't have any much more than a skim of paint on the bottom. Laying the knife flat, and I'm just scraping it across the surface. Doesn't take much, but it's going to create a beautiful texture that you just can't replicate with a brush. This is such a fun technique. If you're looking for something to add in the background, very subtle, this can be very beachy, this can be very Halloweenish, this can be just texture on a Santa suit. It's just a great way to add interest very, very easily. And it's always so impressive because it looks like it took a lot of time. I'm keeping the palette knife going the direction in my mind that the wood grain would run. And even though I make a swipe across it, I can take it and go back and forth. And there always seems to be just a little bit of texture that's going to rub off. You can add as much or as little. Just kind of look at it and see if it's... I wanted the look of chip paint, so I wanted it to look very, not even, but very evenly weathered. I guess that would be a good way to describe it. This originally was white, and the white paint has chipped off. I normally don't do different colors underneath, but I thought that would create more the look of the weathered effect if it had different colors beneath it. And I'm going to run up and down on the side panels, across on the top and bottom. Because this is just such a light application of paint, it does need to be reloaded and reapplied often. But when I run it through the paint, I pull it out so it's very, very thin on the palette. If you're not sure, do a little bit, let it dry. More can always be added, but it just seems to grab just enough to create that amazing texture. If there's too much, if it's too heavy on the bottom of the palette knife, it's just going to come out as a big blob. So this is a super great way to add texture. It just takes a little bit of patience too. And I always think this is so much fun. It just really another technique that's almost kind of magical. I did the same thing on the base. Now I'm taking Payne's Gray. I pulled the Payne's Gray through on the window pane, and then I wanted to pull it through on the base and the frame as well. So it's on the background, that's what the cat and the spider, and it's just a really strong color. Going around the edge, I have a fair amount of paint on my brush, just laying it in and pulling it across. I don't want it to turn blue, but I want to keep that mystical color, and that's kind of what this is created. Be sure to like and subscribe, hit the bell. That way you won't miss out on future videos. Don't forget to check out other videos that I have on my channel. Let me know if there's some technique that you're interested in that you would like me to cover. I try to do something different every time, not only seasonally, but technique-wise as well. Back to the pumpkin, I just used a white chalk pencil to kind of put where facial placement is going to be. I love the chalk pencil. It disappears with water. It's a great tool to use. Just be aware it disappears with water. So if you want a tracing line to be there and you paint over it and it disappears, that's why. But this is a great way for placement. I use the chalk pencil often because it gives me such a great guideline, and I can visually see it before I paint it. I'm using my Painter's Pal tool to create the eyes. It's really nice to have a perfectly oval stencil and use that with my Spectacular stencil brush and Payne's Gray. Just very lightly tap in the eye. I wipe off the stencil and position it and stencil in the other eye. It will make perfect eyes. 2 light coats is better than 1 heavy coat. I went ahead and stenciled the mouth, even though it's going to be a slightly different shape. This gives me a really nice template to build on. All I have to do is fatten out the mouth towards the bottom, almost like an egg shape, but you can see how that eliminates and makes it really simple to create that eye. I want to go ahead and position where I want the pupils to be, and I'll use that same template. I'm using the same Painter's Pal template to stencil the eyes. They are antique white. I just made a little tiny white dot with the chalk pencil so I knew where to center each one of the eyes. Using the antique white will provide a nice opaque base, especially over top of this dark Payne's Gray. Just taking my number 2 radical round, base coating the tooth in, and pulling a little side edge down the left side of the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. That's going to add that thickness on the pumpkin. I'm using my Epic script liner for this. Just a nice little thin line. If you don't have the Painter's Pal, it's such a great tool. There's several different styles. This is the Angle Mate. Look how simple it is to paint that triangle nose. I'm just stenciling it with Payne's Gray, adding that little side edge with antique white, and the mouth, the eyes are just perfect. I don't want the eyes antique white. I want them the sunset gold. So I'm just adding a top coat over the antique white because that provides such a nice opaque base. The eyes are really going to glow. And I'm using the diverse dry brush to add those in. And then I'm taking that canyon orange, just doing a very thin wash over the side edge of each of the eyes, nose, and mouth. That's going to add, really adds a lot of dimension. It's such a fun little element to pop that in there. I'm going to brighten that center section of each of them a little bit with sunset gold, highlighting the bottom or the tip of the tooth with snow white. I want that to really stand out. A little bit of a blush of snow white on the bottom right of the eyes. It's just going to help them look a little bit glassy and a little more rounded. And just blend it out. Remember, it will tone down as it dries. Taking some black plum and shading against the left side of the eyes, and that really kind of sets the eyes back in there. It's a great way to push them back and add a little bit of dimension. Taking Payne's Gray, and I'm shading the top and the bottom, also the base of the tooth. Still using my 1/8 inch awesome angle. Dip dotting the pupils of the eyes with Payne's Gray. I'm just using the fat end of my stylus to get those in there. Look how cute he is. And Epic Script Liner and black or Payne's Gray to line the eyebrows. Just adds a little more expression. A little bit of sparkle in the top left of each eye. This is with Snow White. Highlight the center of the cut edges. Look how that really makes them stand out. Just that one little touch of paint. Bringing some of that canyon orange, just a little bit of a hint of orange where that candlelight's going to bounce off. Just a light touch of color. The eyes were a little bit flat, so I did add a little more color in that. A hint of aqua sky on that little tiny pupil, bottom right corner, left side of the stem, and also on the pumpkin. Just a hint of color. It just doesn't take much, and boy, what a difference it makes. Not sure I covered the stem. It was painted portobello, shaded on the bottom and left side with Payne's Gray. Then I did some line work with my Epic Script Liner to create those ridges with antique white and then snow white, and add a hint of aqua sky. And you can see on this aqua sky, it's just a touch, just to give that indication. But look how it just creates that soft glow. Put a little bit in the mouth, in the dark areas of the mouth and the eyes. Now I'm painting the Spiderwebs, and I'm using my Epic Script Liner and Snow White. Just a simple couple lines and for the main ribs, and then create those little rounded scoops for the cross webs. And these don't have to be perfect. In fact, if they're not perfect, they're not all matched, I think it adds a little more personality and just makes it a little more fun. I wanted to make sure that the spider webs fit exactly inside of the window pane, so I put the overlay on top of the window, and that way I can really make sure. I want a nice long line for those spider webs. I don't want to have to patch it in and touch it up. So this was a real easy way to add that in there, so I knew exactly where it was going to be without having to trace it on there. And one thing about the chalk, I thought about using a chalk pencil, but if you're using a chalk pencil as a base for a white line, sometimes it gets a little confusing when you start to paint it. You end up with a double line and you really can't tell which one is the chalk pencil and which one is the white paint. So you have to wait until it dries and then just kind of erase it with water and go on. So it's not a big deal. It just sometimes it's easier to just kind of wing it. Sometimes it's kind of fun to just wing it. Just put that overlay back on there. I wanted these cobwebs to be different directions just for a little more interest. Make sure that your brush is thinned down, has enough water in it that you're able to create nice long strokes. When it becomes glumpy or drags and leaves kind of skips, then you know there's not enough moisture in the brush. It just needs to be able to flow on and paint a lot of strokes before you have to reload. That's the way it should paint. And you know when you've got a nice brush load, it just boom, boom, boom. Those strokes can easily be added. Just glides right along there. And one more here at the bottom. I did, after I completely finished the project, and I didn't film it, but I did add another little tiny cobweb on the right side of the candle. It just looked a little off balance, and the more I looked at it, the more I felt it needed just that one more thing. So that will be in the pattern and in the line drawing. And if you decide you like it without, that's fine too. But I thought it just needed a little more to bring that continuity in there. I love how the spider web shows up over the cat. It's just a really nice touch. I wanted to reposition the frame to make sure it's going to look great, and then I'm picking up just a hint of Payne's Gray to more or less add a shadow on the corners of where the panes were going to overlay. It just kind of mutes down that spider web a little more in the corner sections, and then that helps to allow the brighter part of the web to really stand out. Anywhere that it just seemed a little too strong, I just take the toe of my angle with that hint of Payne's Gray, just kind of swipe it along those long ribs, and you see how that adds that hint of shadow, makes the web look a little dimensional. The bat, I'll tell you, I had a struggle with the bat to try to decide what color to paint it, and I ended up base coating it with antique white and thought it would be, I needed it to coordinate with the rest of the elements in the design. I thought starting out with the brighter base, then I could lay those colors in and maybe get a little more shading and highlighting with a lot less fuss. On the candies, I just jumped right in with my number 10 Fabulous Fantastic Filbert and Sunset Gold, just to base coat the candy section of the wrap candy. This candy is super easy to paint, and I hope you give it a try. Picked up some black plum on my 1/4 inch angle, and I'm starting to define where the bat's body is going to be. So I'm adding this on the left side of the bat, the wings, and just kind of pulling it down. I know the wings aren't going to be this antique white color, but I want to just have a soft covering on that. And then I use the chisel edge of the brush to pull down where those ribs and the wings are going to lay. And I'm not too particularly fussy. I just want to get some nice color, blend it out. Same thing on the other wing, just a little bit of a shadowing against the bat. And then I forgot which way the ribs were going to go, so I had to move the paint around. My paint is very loose, which means it has a lot of moisture in it, so I can move it around, just clean my brush, and then lift out some of that paint, scooch it around so it's not so heavy. If your paint is too thick and too heavy, you won't have time to work with it. And this gave me time to shift it around so that you could see how movable it is. And I just wanted that basic structure of the bat to be on there. Let it dry really well. And now I'm going in with Payne's Gray to, this is the shadow area. I want to blend that together nicely. And this will be in the little crook of those wing sections and then pulling it down. So I want that to be nice and dark up at the top, and as it gets down to the part that stretches out and is a little more tight, I let that become a little bit lighter. I did have a lot of paint on my brush, cleaned it out a little bit, and then just moved what's on the bat around. So I didn't wipe it off, I just went back and just repositioned the paint. Thinking where the shadow areas are, it's going to be darker where the bat is. This is where I can really correct where that rib goes. Kind of a long curved one in that shaded on inside. And you can see how the basic structure of the bat is showing up. Top coating, I'm going to jump between the candy and the bat. Top coating the candy with Canyon Orange. This is just a quick, even, soft coat. And because the yellow is so vivid and bright, it just doesn't take much to get a nice covering on that. I did allow the top to be just a little bit lighter. Going back in with a little more Payne's Gray. The bat's kind of choppy, so I want to smooth it out and bring a little more darkness to the bat. I did go to my 1/2 inch angle. If you feel like you need to jump down to a smaller brush for better control, not a problem. I work best with a bigger brush. I feel like I can cover the area a little more quickly, a little more smoothly, and still have good control. And you can see what a difference that makes having that second coat. Going in with Heritage Brick to shade the sides and the bottom of the candies. And I work back and forth between the bat and the candies, not to drive everybody crazy, but it gives me time to let that paint set up and dry before I go back to the bat and then come back to the candy. It's good to go. The wrapper ends, I went ahead and base coated those, not solidly, but with a nice float of Payne's Gray, heavier toward the base of the wrapping, and then just let it float out toward the tips of the wrapped areas. Provides a nice shadow for the gathered wrap. Kind of a quick way to do the wrapping. It just doesn't take a whole lot of effort. I am deepening that shading with some red spice. Just love the way those colors work together. They're absolutely beautiful. That candy really glows, and I kind of wondered at this point if I wanted to even put wrappers on it. So now I'm using Aqua Sky to highlight the left side of the bat. Very thin, very soft, and I'm using this to go down the ribs or across the bottom of the wings and pull it up in that thin part. It just turns that yellowish antique white base into a soft blue and kind of pulls it all together, adding that hint of color on the bat that we brought through all the rest of it. And I did do just a light coat and let it dry, and then I went back and built it up until I was satisfied with it. This is another one of my painter's tools. This is the Peppermint Pal. You can paint this on with a number 2 radical round, but these painter tools are such great painting helper tools, and it makes it super easy. It's not the right size, but I'm going to stencil the basic shape in. Then I can grab my number 2 radical round and I can just complete the stripes by pulling it out to the edge. To me, that's so much easier than trying to paint the entire stripe and make sure that I get them even, and it just goes a lot quicker. And look how nice that looks. Just really simple to finish up the stripes. On the rectangle candy, I use Payne's Gray and my number 2 radical round to paint stripes. If you just keep an even pressure on the brush, the stripes will be perfect. And there's going to be a lot of wrapper on this, so don't be too fussy if it's not exactly perfect. I did go back with a little bit of Snow White to highlight the top of the wing and pulling it down into the ribs. My paint is very loose. I had a little bit of an overpaint. I can just go in with a clean brush and move it around. Just a hint of white. And remember, the white always paints on a lot stronger than it dries. So I can just be very conservative on how I paint it. Always go back and add more if I need to. Just that little bit really will make those ribs stand out and enhance those wings. I dipped out of the eyes antique white and I did not like that, so I went back and added aqua sky eyes. While that was drying, just floated a hint of Payne's Gray over the shading. Just really deepens down that shading. With that white wrapper, it's going to make a big difference, but don't get it too dark. Highlighted the center part of the candies with a touch of aqua sky, and just use my finger to kind of tone it down a little bit. The wrapper is really easy to create. I've loaded the toe of my 1/4 inch Awesome Angle with Snow White, and I'm just floating it around the outer edge to create that outer wrapping. Very light float of paint. I will do this several times, leaning in on the toe of my brush to pull some gathers across the candy, using a little bit of a curve. That makes the candy look a little more dimensional. Going to float the white at the base of the twisted wrapped end and then pull some out to replicate the look of gathers. Keep this light and a little bit heavy on that side. I'm just going to walk that out. It has a much darker undertone on the one side than the other, which we'll go back and address that. Keeping that Snow White float very loose, very workable, and I can just add the wraps like that. It's just very, very easy. Float it around. Make sure the paint is fluid enough that you can walk it around, float it around, create those gathers. My paint is very wet. This first coat, when it dries, will be very subtle, but it still will give that look of that cellophane wrap. And I'm using the chisel edge to pull it up, the flat of the brush to float, the chisel edge to pull it up. Highlight the tips just a little bit stronger. There's so many different things it can be done with this little bit of wrap. And I did do a video on wrap candy just by itself. If you have trouble hanging on to a piece, double stick tape, or if you're not interested in that, I usually just grab my stylus and I can keep it anchored in place. I did go back a few more times and just added some soft floats until I was satisfied with the brightness of the wrapper. Don't want to obscure the candy when I was finished with the floating, I loaded my Epic script liner and just pulled tiny thin lines across using my brush and Snow White, and that creates the crisp folds and edges. I did add a hint of aqua sky in the folds of the wrappers just to bring a little bit of that cool blue in there. And on the bat, the eyes were shaded with a little bit of Payne's Gray, highlighted with a touch of Snow White, added a Payne's Gray dip dot pupil with a little bit of sparkle Snow White highlight in the top left of each. I erased all the tracing lines and varnished all of the pieces with ultra matte varnish. I usually use a couple light coats, let it dry well between coats. After it was completely dry, I glued all the pieces together using Aleene's tacky glue. You can use whatever glue is your preference. I just find this one works really well for me. I love how it turned out. I hope you are as impressed with how using these techniques can easily create a moody, magical Halloween atmosphere. Everything I used is listed in the links below. Let me know if you have any comments or questions. I would love to hear from you. Be sure to like and subscribe. That way you won't miss out on future videos. Thank you for joining me today on this unusual project, and I look forward to our next painting adventure together. And remember, a little bit of paint makes a big difference.